in the winter dark outside Moscow, a young German officer with the most radioactive surname in Europe was dragged through a prison gate and into the Soviet system. He was not Adolf Hitler. He was family. And once the NKVD realized who he was, the question stopped being how long he would live and became what his bloodline was worth. We tend to imagine dictators as men who appear from nowhere, towering alone over history. But tyrannies are built by networks, by relatives, by favorites, by people who share the private rooms and holiday tables that never make it into propaganda posters. Adolf Hitler's own family was small, awkward, and full of half-siblings and strained loyalties. He kept some at a distance, used others when it suited him, and lavished attention on a select few. Those choices, petty, personal, almost domestic, would collide with the largest war in human history, and in two separate moments, in two separate Soviet catastrophes turned into Soviet victories, Hitler's nephews fell into Red Army hands. Their stories are not just footnotes to an infamous name. They are windows into how the Soviet state handled special prisoners, how intelligence and symbolism mattered as much as bullets, and how the personal obsessions of two dictators, Hitler and Stalin, could shape the fate of individual men. Because when one of those nephews became a bargaining chip, Hitler made an offer that sounds like the premise of a thriller and was, in fact, documented history. He proposed exchanging his captured relative for Stalin's son. Stalin refused flatly. No sentimental speeches, no dramatic hesitation, just refusal. And in that refusal, you can hear the cold logic of a regime that treated family as expendable and power as the only currency. To understand how Hitler's nephews ended up in Soviet captivity, you have to start with the strange geography of Hitler's own household. Adolf Hitler had a half-brother, Alois Hitler Jr., with whom he had a strained relationship. Alois was never the kind of family member Hitler wanted around the center of his carefully staged image. But Alois had a son, Heinrich, known as Heinz Hitler, who did not merely admire his uncle from afar. Heinz idolized him. He wanted to become him, or at least become what the Nazi state promised a young man could become if he proved himself, a hardened leader, a future elite, a believer. In the Nazi world, belief was a credential. Heinz Hitler was a committed National Socialist, and he dreamed of following in his uncle's footsteps. Adolf Hitler, for all his distance from his half-brother, showed affection toward his nephew. That affection had limits, and those limits mattered. Hitler helped Heinz enter a national political institute of education, and a Pola, specifically the one in Ballensted, an elite academy designed to shape future leaders of the Nazi Party and the SS. Napolas were not ordinary schools. They were ideological factories, places where discipline, physical toughness, and loyalty were cultivated like crops. The corridors smelled of polish and sweat, the training grounds echoed with shouted commands, and the curriculum was built around the idea that the individual existed to serve the Reich. But Hitler's favor came with a condition. Heinz was expected to achieve everything by himself, without the kind of overt patronage that might look like nepotism. In a regime obsessed with image, even family connections had to be disguised as merit. So Heinz went forward as thousands of other young Germans did, wearing the uniform not as a costume, but as an identity. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the war became something else entirely. It was not just a clash of armies, it was a war of annihilation, a struggle in which Nazi ideology framed Slavs and Jews as targets for destruction, and the Soviet state framed the invader as an existential threat. In that furnace, Heinz Hitler, now 21 years old, served as a subaltern officer in the 23rd Potsdam Artillery Regiment. Artillery was the blunt instrument of the Eastern Front, mud-choked gun positions, frozen metal that burned the skin in winter, deafening concussions that shook teeth, and the constant arithmetic of shells and distances. He participated in the invasion and was awarded the Iron Cross, second class, an official stamp of bravery or service that, in the Nazi military culture, was both honor and expectation. But the Eastern Front devoured expectations. By late 1941, the German advance had reached the outskirts of Moscow. Then the weather turned and the Red Army struck back. The Soviet counteroffensive around Moscow, launched in early December 1941 and continuing into the new year, was not a single punch, but a series of blows delivered by exhausted troops who fought with the desperation of a state that had been driven to the brink. Snow and smoke blurred the horizon. Villages became ash. Roads became ash. Roads became ice. Men froze where they fell. German units that had expected a quick victory found themselves fighting for Sametakol. On January 10, 1942, during that major Red Army counteroffensive, Heinz Hitler was captured in the Vyazma region west of Moscow. Vyazma was a name already soaked in blood and encirclement. The area had seen massive battles and chaotic movement of armies. Capture on the Eastern Front was not like capture in the tidy imagination of older European wars. It was hunger, shock, and fear, hands raised in a white landscape. The sudden silence after artillery, the realization that the rules you thought existed might not apply here. And then came the moment that transformed Heinz from a prisoner into a curiosity, a prize, a problem. Once identified as a relative of the Soviet Union's enemy number one, he was not treated as an ordinary POW. He was transferred to Moscow's Butyrka. Butyrka was not just a building. It was a symbol of the Soviet security apparatus, a place where the walls had absorbed decades of interrogations, where the air itself seemed stale with secrecy. Prisoners disappeared into its routines and its paperwork. The NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, was the state's instrument of control, and it understood the value of names. A Hitler in custody was not merely a soldier. He was potential intelligence and potential propaganda. Yet Heinz Hitler's story ends with a bluntness that feels almost anticlimactic, which is precisely what makes it so chilling. Very little is known about what happened to him after he was brought to Butyrka. What is documented is the outcome. He died there on February 21, 1942, just weeks after his capture. In Germany, the truth was not known. He was listed as missing in action. The Reich that catalogued everything, that built a cult of sacrifice and heroism, could not even write the final line of his biography. Somewhere in the Soviet machinery, he became a file, a corpse, and then a silence. Why did he die so quickly? The record does not give us the satisfying certainty of a courtroom verdict. The Eastern Front produced deaths by disease, malnutrition, untreated wounds, and the brutal conditions of detention. But the lack of detail itself is a kind of answer. In the Soviet system, especially in wartime, the state did not feel obligated to narrate the fate of its captives. The story belonged to the victors, and Heinz Hitler, the nephew who wanted to be a Nazi leader, vanished into a prison that had swallowed countless others. If that were the only nephew to fall into Soviet hands, the tale would be grim but straightforward. A young ideologue captured near Moscow, dead within weeks, his family name offering no protection. But another nephew, older, more pragmatic, and far closer to Hitler personally, would be taken in a far more dramatic setting, at a moment when the world watched an entire German army collapse. His name was Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr., the son of Hitler's half-sister Angela Raubal. Unlike Heinz, Leo did not build his identity around ideological zeal. He joined the Nazi Party in 1932, which is a documented fact and not a trivial one. 1932 was the year before Hitler became Chancellor, a time when joining the party signaled alignment with a rising, violent political force. But Leo kept an arm's-length relationship with politics. He was not one of the fanatics who lived for rallies and slogans. In the private hierarchy of Hitler's affections, however, Leo mattered. Adolf Hitler considered him his favorite nephew and spent time with him. In a life where Hitler's relationships were often transactional or distorted, that favoritism was real enough to be noticed. Before the war, Leo lived a relatively ordinary professional life for a man with such a connection. He worked as a manager at a steel plant in Linz, Austria. Linz was not just any city in Hitler's imagination. It was tied to his youth and his fantasies of cultural grandeur. But the war pulled everyone into uniform. Shortly after World War II began in September 1939, Leo, 32 years old, was drafted. He joined the Luftwaffe as a lieutenant in the engineering corps. That detail matters. He was not a frontline infantryman by role, but an officer responsible for technical and engineering tasks, the kind of work that keeps an army functioning: bridges, repairs, logistics, the hidden skeleton of war. Then came Stalingrad. By late 1942, the German Sixth Army, under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, was fighting in and around the city on the Volga that bore Stalin's name. Stalingrad was a battle of ruins, a grinding contest where factories became fortresses and apartment blocks became graveyards. In November 1942, the Soviet Operation Uranus encircled the Sixth Army. The trap snapped shut. More than 200,000 German and Allied troops were cut off from the main German forces. The Luftwaffe attempted to supply the pocket by air, but the numbers never matched reality. The encircled force needed hundreds of tons daily, and the airlift delivered far less, under constant Soviet attack and in murderous winter weather. Inside the pocket, everything deteriorated. Food shrank to starvation rations, ammunition became precious. Frostbite spread. Horses were slaughtered. Men burned furniture for warmth. The wounded lay in makeshift shelters with little medicine. In that collapsing world, Leo Roble wound. Paulus suggested that he be flown out airlifted home. It was a rational suggestion. A wounded officer with a direct connection to Hitler, a man who could be spared without affecting the doomed fate of the army. Hitler refused. The refusal is one of those moments where personal pride and political theater override human logic. Hitler stated that as an officer, Leo should stay with his men. It sounds like a harsh commitment to equality of sacrifice, but in context it was something else. Hitler's obsession with holding Stalingrad at any cost, his contempt for retreat, his belief that willpower could defeat arithmetic. He would not allow exceptions, even for family, because exceptions would imply that the situation was hopeless, and to admit hopelessness was to undermine the myth he had built around his own infallibility. So Leo stayed. The pocket tightened. Soviet artillery pounded the remnants. German positions shrank into icy rubble. On January 23, 1943, Leo Rudolf Roble Jr. was captured by Soviet troops. This time the Soviets did not immediately know what they had. At first, his family ties were not recognized. It was Leo himself who revealed them, and other captured officers corroborated his story. It is a strange human detail. In captivity, Leo chose to speak the truth of his identity. Was it a bid for protection? A hope that being Hitler's nephew would grant him better treatment? Or did he imagine that his capture might matter, that he might become valuable? He was right about one thing: he mattered. Not as a person, perhaps, but as an asset. Lieutenant Rubal was taken to Moscow for interrogation. Interrogations in wartime Moscow were not gentle interviews. They were structured efforts to extract military intelligence and political insight, conducted by professionals trained to exploit fear, fatigue, and isolation. The Soviets wanted to know everything about the enemy, troop dispositions, morale, internal rivalries, and, crucially, the psychology of Nazi leadership. A nephew who had been close to Hitler was a rare opportunity. In Moscow, Rabel provided detailed information about his uncle's relatives, habits, daily routine, and interests. He also offered insight into Hitler's inner circle, describing who had influence and to what degree. That kind of information might sound like gossip, but in the world of intelligence it was valuable. Dictatorships are opaque by design. The struggle for access to the leader often determines policy. Understanding who could sway Hitler, who he trusted, and how his day was structured could help Soviet analysts interpret German decisions. It could also become useful later, after the war, when members of that inner circle were captured or interrogated. Names and habits become pressure points. Knowledge becomes leverage. And then the war produced one of its most haunting personal intersections: the fate of Stalin's own son. Yakov Djogashvili, Stalin's first son, served as an artillery battery commander in the Red Army. In July 1941, at the very start of the German invasion, Yakov fell into German hands. His capture was a propaganda prize for the Nazis and a personal humiliation for Stalin. The Soviet leader's relationship with Yakov was complicated and often described as strained, but the political symbolism was enormous. The son of the man leading the Soviet war effort was a prisoner. Hitler, through intermediaries, made an offer. He proposed exchanging his beloved nephew, Leo Robal, for Yakov Djugashvili. It is hard to overstate how extraordinary that offer is. This was not a routine prisoner exchange between equal powers. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were fighting a war of extermination. The Eastern Front was characterized by mass shootings, starvation policies, the destruction of entire communities, and a brutal disregard for the laws of war. And yet, in the middle of that, Hitler suggested a swap grounded in the oldest logic of dynastic conflict: blood for blood, family for family. Stalin refused, flatly. That refusal has been repeated in historical memory as a symbol of Stalin's coldness, and it was cold. But it was also consistent with Soviet wartime ideology and Stalin's personal political calculus. The Soviet state demanded total sacrifice. Millions of families had sons in German captivity or dead in the snow. If Stalin traded for his own son, he would elevate his family above the suffering of the nation and undercut the narrative that all were equal in duty. He would also allow Hitler to claim a propaganda victory, proof that Stalin could be pressured through personal leverage. Stalin's refusal signaled that he would not be bargained with on those terms. The irony is brutal. Hitler, who had refused to airlift his own nephew out of Stalingrad because an officer should stay with his men, now tried to use that nephew as a bargaining chip. Stalin, who demanded sacrifice from everyone, refused the one deal that might have brought his own son back. Two dictators, both obsessed with image and control, treated family as symbols rather than human beings. And between them sat Leo Raub, alive, interrogated, and suddenly a piece in a game he did not control, treated family, and suddenly appeased. The tension in this story is not only in the battlefield drama, but in the uncertainty of what Soviet captivity would mean for a man like Roybal. In the popular imagination, being related to Hitler would guarantee either preferential treatment or immediate execution. The reality was more bureaucratic, more calculating, and in some ways more terrifying because it could stretch for years. Roybal survived the war. That alone distinguishes his fate from Heinz Hitler's. But survival did not mean freedom. The Soviet Union held vast numbers of German POWs and internees after 1945, using them for labor and as instruments of political leverage. The post-war years in the USSR were marked by reconstruction, shortages, and a security state that remained deeply suspicious of foreigners and former enemies. Many prisoners were filtered through camps and prisons, their cases reviewed not in the way a liberal legal system might review them, but through administrative processes where guilt could be assumed by a sociode. In 1949, Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr. was convicted as a war criminal and sentenced to 25 years in the Gulag. The conviction came despite no evidence of guilt, an important documented point. The charge framed him as having supported Hitler's criminal aggressive policy and being involved in the crimes of the Sixth Army on Soviet soil. This was the logic of collective responsibility. You were part of the machine, therefore you were culpable. And for someone with Roybal's surname and family ties, the Soviet system had every incentive to treat him as symbolically guilty, even if specific acts could not be proven. The Gulag was not one place but an archipelago of camps spread across the Soviet Union, from forests to tundra. The sentence of 25 years, common in the late Stalin period, was effectively a life sentence in many cases. It meant labor, deprivation, and the slow grinding down of the body. You can imagine the paper trail, a file stamped and restamped, a man reduced to an index card, transported in rail cars, processed through camp gates where the world narrowed to quotas, rations, and survival. And yet history did not end in 1949. Stalin died in 1949. Stalin died in 1943, and the Soviet Union began, unevenly and cautiously, to alter some of its most extreme practices. One of the clearest geopolitical shifts came from outside pressure and diplomacy with the new West German state. Konrad Adenauer, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, pursued the return of German prisoners from the Soviet Union as a major political goal. It was not merely humanitarian, it was nation-building. Families in West Germany lived with uncertainty, and the return of prisoners could strengthen Adenauer's legitimacy and bind the young republic to a narrative of recovery. In 1955, following a petition from Adenauer, thousands of German war criminals were released from Soviet captivity. Among them was Leo Robal. The year matters. 1955 was also the period when West Germany regained a greater degree of sovereignty and began integrating into the Western alliance system. The Cold War context shaped everything. For the Soviet leadership, releasing prisoners could be a diplomatic gesture, a bargaining move, or a way to reduce the burden of holding them. For the prisoners, it was the end of a long grey captivity that had outlasted the war itself. Robal returned to Linz. The contrast is almost cinematic. From Stalingrad's ruins to Moscow interrogation rooms to the distant machinery of Soviet camps, and then back to an Austrian city trying to live as though Europe had not torn itself apart. He worked as a chemistry teacher until his death in 1977. It is a startlingly ordinary ending for a man who had once sat in Hitler's orbit and then in Stalin's grasp. A classroom chalk dust, lab glassware, the quiet repetition of lessons after a life that had been shaped by two of the century's most violent regimes. Now step back and look at the two nephews side by side, because the comparison is where the story sharpens. Heinz Hitler, the younger man, the ideological devotee shaped by Napoleon, was captured near Moscow on January 10, 1942, and died in Bututu, and died in Bityrka prison on February 24. His death was quick, his paper trail thin, his fate largely unknown even to the regime that had raised him. In Germany he remained missing in action, a bureaucratic phrase that hides grief and uncertainty. Leo Raubal, the older man, politically cautious but personally favored by Hitler, was captured at Stalingrad on January 23, 1943. He survived interrogation, became the subject of an extraordinary proposed exchange involving Stalin's son, and then lived through years of post-war Soviet imprisonment, only to be released in 1955 and die decades later in relative anonymity. Why the difference? Partly it was timing. Heinz was captured in early 1942, when the Soviet Union was still reeling, paranoid, and fighting for survival near its capital. The NKVD's wartime environment was brutal and improvisational. Resources were scarce, fear was abundant, and prisoners could die quickly from the conditions of detention. Leo was captured in 1943, after the Soviet victory at Stalingrad had begun to shift momentum. By then, Soviet intelligence could afford to be more methodical. A nephew who could provide insight into Hitler's inner circle was worth keeping alive. Partly it was perceived value. Heinz was a junior artillery officer. His ideological zeal did not translate into strategic importance. Leo, by contrast, had personal access to Hitler and could speak about the dictator's habits, routines, and relationships. The Soviet Union was building not only a military victory, but a post-war narrative and a post-war intelligence advantage. Knowing who mattered around Hitler could pay dividends later, and partly it was the way both regimes treated family as currency. Hitler's affection for Heinz helped him get into Napola, but it did not save him. Hitler's affection for Leo was real enough that he refused to airlift him out of Stalingrad, not to protect him, but to protect Hitler's own image of unyielding resolve. Then, when Leo was captured, Hitler tried to use him as leverage anyway, offering a swap for Yakov Dzhugashvili. Stalin refused because accepting would have revealed a vulnerability and contradicted the Soviet ethos of collective sacrifice. The proposed exchange is the story's dramatic center because it exposes the emotional hypocrisy of both systems. Imagine the chain of events. that had to happen for that offer to exist. Leo has to be captured alive. He has to reveal his identity. Soviet interrogators have to confirm it. Hitler has to be informed and has to believe the Soviets might bargain. Intermediaries have to carry the proposal. And Stalin has to consider what it would mean to trade a single German officer, even one with Hitler's blood for his own son, who had been in German captivity since July 1941. And then Stalin says no. What did Yakov's captivity mean in this context? It meant that even the leader of the Soviet Union could not or would not save his own family member from the war's machinery. Yakov's fate remained a painful symbol. The exchange did not happen. The Soviet leadership chose the message over the man. The Nazis, who had made propaganda out of Yakov's capture, could not force Stalin's hand with it. The aftermath for Leo Rubal also reveals something about the Soviet post-war approach to justice. His 1949 conviction, despite no evidence of guilt, is not an isolated anomaly in a system that often pursued politically useful outcomes over evidentiary standards. The Soviet Union had genuine reasons to prosecute war crimes. Nazi Germany committed vast atrocities on Soviet territory, resulting in millions of civilian deaths and unimaginable destruction. But the Soviet legal machinery could also be blunt, sweeping, and shaped by political needs. Rubal's sentence served a symbolic purpose. The nephew of Hitler punished as a war criminal, regardless of whether he personally committed specific crimes. And yet, his release in 1955 shows how quickly symbols can be traded away when political circumstances change. The Soviet Union, now in a Cold War struggle for influence, could release prisoners as part of diplomacy. Adenauer's petition mattered because West Germany mattered. Because West Germany mattered. Because West Germany mattered. The same Soviet state that had sentenced Rubal to 25 years could reverse course within 6 years, not because a court discovered new evidence, but because geopolitics shifted. There is another irony here, quieter but sharp. Hitler's family name, which had opened doors for Heinz and brought personal attention to Leo, became a liability in captivity, but not in the way people might assume. It did not lead to immediate execution. It led to bureaucratic exploitation, intelligence. It did not lead to immediate execution. It did not lead to it. In the Soviet system, being special often meant being processed more carefully, not more mercifully. And what does all of this tell us beyond the grim curiosity of Hitler's nephews? It tells us that the Second World War was not only fought by anonymous masses, but also by individuals trapped in the gravitational pull of powerful relatives and powerful states. Heinz Hitler wanted to ride his uncle's myth into the Nazi elite. Instead, he died in a Moscow prison, his end so obscure that even the Reich could not record it. Leo Rubal tried to keep politics at a distance, yet his proximity to Hitler pulled him into the war and made him valuable to Soviet interrogators. He survived, but survival came with years of punishment that required no proof beyond association and symbolism. It tells us that dictatorships devour intimacy. In both Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, family ties were never purely private. They were political assets, vulnerabilities, and propaganda tools. Hitler could be affectionate, but he was also calculating and image-obsessed. Stalin could be paternal in propaganda, but in practice he was ruthless, willing to sacrifice even his own son rather than appear weak or unequal before the nation. And it tells us something uncomfortable about how history works. The most dramatic offers, the kind that sound like legend, can be real, documented, and still lead nowhere. A nephew for a son. A bargain between monsters. A deal that, in another kind of world, might have been accepted instantly. But in the world of 1943, it was refused because the message mattered more than the life. When you picture the Eastern Front, it's easy to think only in terms of armies and arrows on a map, but the war was also Batirka's corridors, Stalingrad's frozen rubble, interrogation rooms in Moscow, and the long grinding years of post-war captivity. It was the sound of boots on prison floors, the scrape of a pen, signing a 25-year sentence, the quiet shock of stepping off a train in 1955 and realizing you are alive in a world that has moved on without you. And maybe the most haunting reflection is this: Heinz Hitler and Leo Raubal were not architects of genocide. They were not the men who planned the invasion of the Soviet Union or designed the machinery of extermination. But they were close enough to power by blood, by uniform, by proximity, that history treated them as symbols. One died quickly, swallowed by wartime secrecy. The other lived long enough to become a bargaining chip, a convicted war criminal without evidence, and then a released prisoner in a Cold War d'état. Today, when we talk about the relatives of dictators, it's often with morbid curiosity, as if bloodlines carry a storybook curse. The truth is more human, more frightening. Bloodlines don't determine fate, states do. Systems do. The machinery of war and propaganda and intelligence does. In the end, Hitler's nephews discovered what millions of others learned in the 20th century. In a conflict between empires and ideologies, even the most infamous surname in Europe could not guarantee protection. It could only guarantee that your life would be used until it was discarded.